22-year-old guy hasn't been to seminary, hasn't had any training. Matter of fact, he doesn't make his assertions based on ancient Greek or ancient Hebrew. So a young homosexual guy who the Methodists allowed to give a little talk about how homosexuality in the Bible is not condemned, right? The arguments he makes are they're old. The standard arguments have been made since the turn of the century by homosexuals, and I may bring up a little bit, but the point is that he hasn't plowed any new ground. It's just that, and I'm not sure why well, I know why it's characterized, because we have a president that kind of evolved in his mind. In the old times we call that flip-flopping, but now it's evolving. So maybe we're evolving, right? Does that mean that before he was like a monkey and now he's a man? Or maybe before he was a man and now he's homosexual? I don't know. But homosexuals don't reproduce. So certainly can't be a man, but that's another problem. I don't know. In any case, let's look at this. I've got the words of the day, and these are the same words I had last week because they're pertinent to a singular verse in here. Mayim means, this is water, but it's in Hebrew, Mayim is a euphemistic. All terms in Hebrew are euphemistic, all right, have euphemistic connotations. This word in Hebrew means water, but it also means human fluids. And there are other words that are used for water. There's a word for salt water, there's a word for fresh water and moving water, etc., etc. But the word mayim means water, but it's a euphemism for human fluids. So whatever fluids you want, that's what it sets in. And really fits within the context. We'll see what that is. Manuka is a feminine, and I rarely bring up the gender. Now, words have gender. Humans have sex as a verb or a noun. Whenever you hear the word gender, that's a misuse of the English language. Now, it's becoming, someday, if not already, it will become not a figment of the imagination, but maybe a reality. But there's no such thing as gender with a human being. Human beings don't have gender. Only nouns or words have gender. Gender is not a human thing. But you know why, right? No. Because human beings are XX or XY. So you have one choice or the other, right? There are some unfortunate people that are born with multiple, there's other things, like for example, there's XXX, usually this is they're still female, and there's also, I think, a possibility of XXY, but you're still male. And there are then those that are unfortunate that have birth defects, where they have the characteristics of both, right? But it's a birth defect. It's not norm in the human beings, and it's less than 1%. It's a very small percentage. So it's a genetic defect. So, when we talk about sex, people today want to talk about what? Gender, which means what I think I am. So, even though you have XX chromosome and you're a female, you might think you're a male. Well, my goodness gracious, what an interesting idea. Lots of people have delusions, but most of the time we classify that as mental illness. But, it's interesting. Words have gender, and I usually haven't talked much about gender with you, but I do want to mention gender. When we see gender being expressed, especially in ancient languages, let's talk about this for a second. This word means to settle down, to settle. But there are a lot of words I can use to settle, like yeshab. is the normal one we've seen. Minach means to settle down, used specifically to dwell or to be comfortable or to have an abode. So when we use this word to mean settle, we mean basically to have a house or a home. Now what's interesting about this in ancient languages, in all languages, has anyone studied a foreign language? Okay. Did it have gender for the nouns? Right? In most foreign languages, you have 3 genders. What's the 3 genders of the nouns? Masculine, feminine, and neutrum, neuter. Okay? In English, we have 1 remnant. Actually, we had 2 remnants, but they're gone. Remember what the remnants are? Anybody remember? In English, vessels, and hurricanes were still left with a female gender to the noun. So when you talked about a vessel, you'd always talk about it as she or her, right? For a boat, for a vessel. The same is true of hurricanes. Hurricanes were given female names for years. They retained a female thing because weather phenomena for some reason. Well, you know why, right? I mean, I think it's really interesting.
It's fickle.
Well, no, it's not fickle. That is not why. That is not why they gave the.
No, weather is fickle.
That's not why they named it, gave it a female gender. Anybody want to venture why they gave a female gender to weather?
It's nurturing.
Yeah.
Is it a Greek goddess?
Not Greek. It's Saxon. It's Anglo-Saxon goddess. Frida was the goddess of the winds and the goddess of weather. And Frida was there for all storm cells. Now, in Greek thought, who was the god of the weather? Zeus, right? So Zeus's fault. But vessels, why would a vessel be given a female gender, perhaps? It protects you and carries you, right? Bingo. But, modern feminism and feministas, I would say, in America have gotten rid of any of the remnants. Now, they would have had a problem in German and in French and in Spanish. Why?
All nouns are masculine and feminine.
Or neutral, depending on the thing. Yes, I believe, I do German and Saxon languages, mainly in Saxon and, basic English, right? In Saxon and Germanic languages, you always have the 3. And I believe in Spanish and French, French has a neuter, doesn't it? Or does it have only masculine and feminine?
I mean, generally Spanish is only masculine and feminine because you have to conjugate the verb based on that afterwards.
Yeah. Romance languages, I'm not really a student of Romance languages and study, I do Greek and I do the other ones. But Greek has 3. Has masculine, feminine, neutrum. And Hebrew has masculine, feminine, and a neutrum. But the neuter is less common. The point is this. In the modern languages, can you tell from the gender of the verb anything about the noun? Not really. I mean, some are obvious, like sister, brother, right? Mother, father. Those are obviously have a gender, right? But many of the words like Ball, der Ball, masculine in German, or das Buch, neutrum. Why? Why pick neuter? Why pick? We don't know. We have no idea because as the language becomes more modern, the gender becomes what? Will detach from the purpose of the meaning of the verb or the noun. However, in ancient world languages, which ancient Hebrew is, and so is ancient Greek, what do you expect we could find? A connection. And there is a connection. Because in Hebrew, I have a choice. I can choose, for example, this word is the feminine female version of a word. I have 2 choices. I can use nuach, which is the masculine version, or no, I could use manoach, which is the masculine version, manoach, or I can use nuach, which is the neuter. So if I choose to make this the masculine, what do you think I'm implying?
Family settled.
Well, if I'm applying the masculine, it ain't a family, is it? It's guys coming to take over. It's like you shop. It's like settling for an ambush or whatever. But if I use a feminine, what am I implying? It's a family, right? And if I use a neuter, I'm probably implying just some generic thing. In ancient languages, this is really interesting because in modern languages, they would lead us to believe that there's no gender correlation or importance. But in ancient languages, you get a correlation. So that's an interesting point, I think. This word means to sparkle. As applied to, sparkle applied to running water, to flow. To run with, literally to run with a sparkle. Run with a sparkle. Maybe like the Doublemint twins, right?
Sparkling wine.
This means to sprout, and the euphemistic meaning is grass. Grass with yields to shop. Naya, a home, to be at home. At home. And rabats. Rabats is to crouch. To crouch on all fours. Or to crouch with all four legs folded. Which, you know, someone made the remark yesterday, or last week, that, you know, it could be somebody going to the bathroom, which is not totally unfounded. You know, it's very interesting. Those things which are appropriate in English may be inappropriate in other cultures, and those things which are inappropriate in English may be appropriate in other cultures. Examples are, for example, showing the bottom of your feet in an Asiatic culture. You know what happens if you show the bottom of your feet in most Asiatic cultures?
Some degree of offense.
That is usually a high degree of offense. Touching the head of a person always implies, in some cultures, touching the head of a person is completely taboo. In a lot of Asiatic cultures, touching the head of a person implies that you are ahead of them. You are their superior. So if you touch the head of a person, you better be cautious about which culture you're in. Shaking hands or touching with the left hand in Muslim cultures that will get you killed in most of those cultures. So there's, you know, and that's just touching. There's many things within cultures. Ways to insult culturally are legion. And until you actually live in a culture, it's very difficult for you to figure out all the different problems with the culture. Or when I say problems, I mean differences between your culture and their culture. And, you know, in a larger respect, anyone who's traveled, well, or studied languages knows what? The culture is different, right? The language is different, cultures are different, everything's different. And so, many times we've seen in the Hebrew poetry, well, all right, how often do you see sexual expression within even some of the most congenial, gentle, and nice English poetry? Anybody ever read Shakespearean sonnet? How often is there sexuality within Shakespearean sonnets? Because remember that in all language and all study, all literature is written, there's a literal, and then there's a thematic level. And then in between, how many levels are there? There could be infinite. I mean, it could be a huge amount. I mean, not infinite, obviously, but there's a lot of levels. It can be lots of levels. So a literal reading, when I have a literal expression of something, and we've looked at literal expression, then there's a thematic expression. We haven't talked much about thematic expression within the Psalms, because to us it's more important to hit the literal. But then you also have a lot of other levels, and we have talked about some of those other levels. And we'll see those, you know. You constantly see those. So let's look at Psalm 23, starting with Yahweh. Now, they say Lord. You notice Lord with capital L-O-R-D. That is Yahweh. And this is Yahweh. Remember, In the last ones we saw, we had Yahweh and Yah-Mim. So we had the two different expressions of Yahweh. One was pronounced Adonai, and the other one was pronounced Elohim. Very interesting. So what would they read? What would a Orthodox Jewish person today, how would they read this? Adonai. Adonai. Adonai, and you notice it says, is my shepherd. That's not what it says. The word is Raha. Did I give you Raha? Did I miss Raha?
Oh, you have her back.
I have Rabat. Raha means, is a verb. Raha is a verb that means to tend a flock. You guys remember the 144th, it was the 144th Psalm? When in the 144th Psalm, we saw all that imagery that was cattle or sheep imagery. Do you remember that? And there was a word, this is a word that was used in there. Raha is a verb that means to tend a flock. So literally this says, Adonai tends the flock, or a flock. What's the flock?
Birds.
Yeah, it could be either his people or it could be what? Well, it could be my flock. It could be he tends the flock that is the people, or it could be that he tends the flock that is my flock. He looks after my flock. Let's mention this too. Everybody should have a, what's your subscription? Superscription, subscription on this?
Psalm of David.
Psalm of David. And remember, of in Hebrew means what? Not by, it means of. So we don't know if this was written by David, about David, you know, whatever. Now I'll bring this up. The Muslims believe that David was inspired with all the Psalms, just the way that Moses was inspired with the Torah, and the way that Muhammad was inspired with the Quran. But it ain't going to work, because a lot of this stuff's post-exilic, and unless David lived 1,000 years, he's going to have a hard time writing it, at least 500 years. So, in any case, you know, this could have been written by David, doubtful. About David, maybe. Fits within that context. Tends a flock. Adonai tend a flock. The I shall is added. It says, not is lo. Lo means low. In Hebrew, when you see this, there's lots of ways of saying not. But lo means not. It's one of the forms of saying not. Not chashir, not to lack. So it says literally, Adonai tends a flock, not want. So who is not want? There's no I in here. You notice how the translator has translated this in what context? From the first person context. But it's not in the first person context. There is no first person context in this at all. The context is, you know, if you want to say it's not even third person, because the way Hebrew works, the context here is who? Adonai. Adonai tends a flock, therefore there will be no lack. There will be no lack. Let's see what it says in 2. It says, he makes me lie down, but the he makes me is pretty much added. The rabats, it's literally, he basically crouch down. Crouch down in desha, in grass, naha, in a grass home. Now, naha means at home, but euphemistically it means pasture, a pasture. So, we have Yahweh and a flock. So Yahweh makes who to crouch down?
Still, I don't define it.
No, it makes the flock to crouch down. Remember, crouching,
Define flock yet.
the flock is, well, it doesn't matter.
Could be sheep.
Well, which level? It
There
could
we
be
go.
one level
Exactly the point.
is human, and the other level is like sheep or goats. You see that? Euphemistically, you know, in the Hebrew, what are we talking about? We're talking about humans? We're talking about animals. Let's see what the context gives us, because that's the point. It could be both, couldn't it? Right? It can't be neither, but it could be both. But for it to be important, what does it really have to be about? People. People. He makes me crouch, and the word that's used as crouch is to crouch, to lay down on your four legs, like an animal, but it can also be applied to human beings.
Not all animals
Because-
lay down on four legs, sheep specifically.
Well, and the thing is that when you, okay, there's a thing here, all right? If you crouch, all right, they're in different cultures, how you crouch.
Lion can crouch to pounce.
Well, the specifics is that you're crouching on four legs. You're putting your legs under you,
At ease.
which means you're at ease. That there are no enemies within
No threats.
your presence. There's no threats. As opposed to, there are other words I can use for crouch or to lay down in Hebrew, see? But this word specifically means to crouch down on all four legs. So and it's not he specifically, it's that crouch down in green pastures, and of course green
Sprouts.
means what? It's
Growing.
growing, it's fresh, it's productive, you know, as opposed to what? Brown pastures, you know, like we have in Kansas in the summertime. So, you know, basically, it goes on, it says, leads, nahal, literally, to run with a sparkle. Now, in Hebrew, euphemistically, nahal can mean to conduct or protect. So, he conducts or protects, and you know, there is no I in here. There is no personal pronoun. Those are added. They're added by the translator. Okay. The translator has some choices here. The translator decided to make this what?
First person instead of.
Well, first person, which makes it very personal,
Yes.
right? I don't see a problem with that.
Try it the other way.
But this goes back to those levels. I mean, I have these levels. This could be first person. It could be second person, you.
Could be singular.
It could be third person, right? Well, first person is singular. Second person, you know, you. Or third person, and it could also be plural. There's no indication this couldn't be plural. Especially since, what's the second word in the whole thing? Flock. So if I have a flock, I'm talking about multi, right? So, you know, we have a first, second, and third person case. This is singular, but I could also have a plural form of that. So first, you know, the plural of the first is what? We, right? We, and in English, we, you, and third person, he, she, them, they, right? So, yeah, a lot wrapped up in here, right? See, there's these levels. I like looking at this level. Yeah, Carl?
Just a question, this is in Hebrew that you're starting with. Hebrew is like a shorthand where you taught that, indicated just the guide to what you say. What would the Orthodox Jew say for the words that are missing that the translator puts in here?
Well,
What did the Greek say when it was translated?
I didn't check the Greek, but it's not shorthand per se, it's the language. And the language has implications because of the verb tenses, you know, whether it's a plural verb or but in the case of a flock, you know, a flock in English is a singular verb, or, right, a singular verb to guide a flock, singular, right? But the context is plural. Do you think the author did that on purpose? Yeah, yeah.
Possessive.
And the context of the other words, you know, obviously the context is he, and so the he's are not wrong. But the I's are not necessarily right. The first person isn't necessarily right, although there's a context. Because in Hebrew, it doesn't work quite like English. And if you remember the ego eimi, you remember the ego eimi thing about Greek, where in Greek you never, ever, ever use the first person possessive or the first person indicative, you know, I am. You don't use that. You don't use that in Hebrew either. The first person indicative in Hebrew means God. Yeah, I am. So you don't ever use that. So in foreign languages, in older languages, we find, what we'll find in Greek is we find there are some ego statements, I statements, that are not ego imi statements. You know, you can say I in a first person. In Hebrew, it's not quite the same.
But don't you think, I think Carl's question is, Carl, forgive me if I'm wrong, but isn't he asking, okay, today, don't the Orthodox Jews accept this personal interpretation of the psalm? I mean, they would.
That's, okay, that's a good question too. I would argue that when you read it within a Hebrew context, you're reading with a Hebrew context. Just like when you read something in an English context. I wish I had a good example in English of where you could do a multi-translation in another text, but it's hard to do. English is a very interesting language because it's very concrete and very euphemistic. Greek is very concrete and not very euphemistic, and Hebrew is very euphemistic. You see this? So in English, what is obvious about English? What can I do in English that I can't do in other languages? In English, I can have an absolute literal context. So I can translate Greek literally in English. I can also translate Hebrew literally in English. And what happens to the Hebrew? It's terrible. The translation would be terrible because, you know, if I translated this one, it would be Rabatz Deshah, so crouch in grass, homes, pastures, run with a sparkle, over and above the mecha, literally the matrimony of repose of Mayim, of waters. And what's the context of that? Well, a Hebrew reader can see the context and understands what it means because it's a euphemistic. The words have euphemistic meanings that within the context fit into what the meaning is. Do you see the point? In English, though, does it make any sense? Now, this is a problem with looking at literal translations, even literal translations from languages. Well, you know, in German, as long as I change the order, I'm cool. Everything works out. But in Hebrew, or how about Latin? Does that work out in Latin? Oh, doesn't work out very well at all. So, I think when a Jewish Orthodox person would read it in Hebrew and recognize the euphemistic levels within it, and they might have the same idea that the translation. What do you have the Stern's translation there with you?
It says, Adonai is my shepherd, I lack nothing.
Yeah.
He has me lie down in grassy pastures, he leads me by quiet water. Pretty much the same. He restores my inner person.
Yeah, pretty much, because the author decided, the translator decided that it would be personal pronouns.
Now, if you were a nomadic person chasing sheep all over, you would get a different understanding because it's a little more personal to you. Those dumb sheep that go everywhere, if you don't take care of them, you'd have no idea, you know. There's kind of a personal touch on the characteristics of sheep.
Well, let's look at this second verse. Let's finish the second verse because I think stuff will become very obvious in the context. Lie down, you know, lie down, rabatz, in green, in grass, homes, pastures, homes, remember, nahal, to run with sparkle, beside, and literally, it's, I usually don't give you prepositions, but since this is a short psalm, the preposition is al, which means over and above. So the al, you know, it says beside in English, but it's not beside, it's over or above, it's not next to. It says over or above. So what's the connotation of over and above?
On the bank, not in the water.
On the bank, not in, and also the other one. If you're a flock and a sheep, then your shepherd towers over you, right? And also the context of over and above is God, remember? In, I can't remember the word, but the word of the heavens, for the heavens in Hebrew, means to be over and above the clouds. So the connotation here is back to Adonai. Over and above, the quiet, and literally the word, this word can be translated to be a couple of things. And I'm going to give them to you. I told you that it means to settle, is its literal meaning. It's feminine, so it means also matrimony. Matrimony is Latin, comes from mater, mother, to settle down with the mother. That's what matrimony is, to settle down with the mother. That's what marriage is, right? So this can be translated matrimony. It also can be translated as a female Israelite. Female Israelite. And then the Mayim, waters. Remember what I told you? This is euphemistic for for human waters, human liquids. So look at what this says within context. He, that is Adonai, and I think that's a good translation, he makes me to crouch down, in other words, to lie at ease in the grass homes. He lets me run with a sparkle, or he runs with a sparkle above me in matrimony. And then it uses a term for water that applies generally as euphemism to humans. So what is he talking about here? He's talking about matrimony. He's talking about settling. He's talking about settling in a place where there's very good land and grass, right? Which is the promised land. He's talking about settling in the promised land. And you notice that, look at the choice of the words. I could have chosen to use a masculine word, right? But I chose feminine to imply marriage. I also chose this word to imply human. You know, and to it, okay, to us it sounds crass, right? But look what the King James translates this word as. You know, I want you to say it. Just look what it says. I gave you the notes. You know, the point is that this implies, you know, for example, human sexuality. It implies marriage. It implies settling. It implies all those things which we as in a culture consider to be refinements of being able to be at peace. And that's the point of this specific one. Literally, if you want a better translation of this that is less literal, is that literally God gives the writer into the arms of blissful marriage. Into blissful marriage and into good, you know, soil and land and pasturage and a great home. Let's go on to the next one. 3. The he is added. It says specifically Schwab. And Schwab, I should have given this as a word. I mean, I should have given you all these as words of the day. But does anybody remember this word? Schwab? If you remember in the context of Hebraic thought, what is your life like in the context of Hebraic thought? And if you think back to what Tin Hodos means, you'll know exactly what I'm talking about.
Journey.
A journey, that's good. In Tin Hodos means what? The way. The way, because it comes from Malachi, where Malachi talks about the way. Here's the way. And Schwab means to turn back. Turn back what? Okay, if here's the good, and here's the bad, what's bad? I don't know. Gehenna, right? So if this means you're going that way, and you turn back, Schwab, you've turned around the path. And that's what the way was all about. Remember the way? Because you turned away from the bad way, right? You got in the way. And that's from Malachi. And so Tin Hodos is the way. So notice that in 3 says, it's not restore. Well, Schwab means to restore in Hebrew, but it literally means to turn back. Turn back. It's not my soul. It's nefesh. Now, you guys remember what nefesh is, right? Nefesh is the word we've been talking about. The breath of life, but not ruach, right? Ruach is the breath or spirit of God, where nefesh is the spirit of life that was breathed into Adam. So you can immediately begin to place this song. Because number 1, he says, he restores my breath, literally my nefesh. So is this talking about soul? Not at all. And the translation in Stern's book what did he call it? He says,
He says my inner person.
my inner person. Now, inner person, now where did that come from? Huh? Huh?
Freud.
No. It came from, do you remember? We had Sarx, Soma, Psyche, and Pneuma. Sarx, Psyche, and Pneuma. Psyche, in Greek thought, is intellect and nephesh, the breath of your life. Where pneuma is what? The soul or the spirit. And sarx is the flesh. In the Hebrew worldview, what did the early Hebrew worldview believe? All you got is what? Sarx and suke. So what he did, what Stern did, is he is using which translation, which idea, which cultural idea for tsuke? Greek, that's right. He's using Greek, which is really interesting, isn't it? But yet, what did the translator use? He used Greek worldview, but what did he do? That's a mistranslation, right? Because it's not soul. Inner being is probably better from a Greek standpoint because it's not pneuma. Pneuma would be what word? Ruach. Ruach. So, very interesting. He makes me turn back, me a breathing creature, that is nephesh, and a breathing creature is what I kind of retranslated, that is. That he has added necha, he guides. Literally, it's not guide, it's transports from exile. Now this is very interesting, because if we're talking about pre-exilic, which exile is he talking about? Egypt. If it's post-exilic, he's talking about coming from Babylon. Or even could be talking about coming from Assyria. It's possible, but we don't hear much. Why don't we hear much about the Assyrian return, if there was such a thing?
Wasn't that exciting?
Well, because it was who? Or whom? Who was it? Who was making the Assyrian return? Those dastardly Israelites. Not the Judahites, right? Not the Judeans, but those dastardly, what do we call them in the New Testament period? Samaritans. Right. Remember the two kingdoms? There was one kingdom. They divided into two, Israel and Judah. Right? And so who cares about the Israelites? They're those evil guys that, from Israel, that
They've been corrupted.
they were corrupted, right? And they got taken by the Assyrians because they were corrupt. And the Judeans were like, yeah, go for it, right? And then they got taken. But we do hear about them. Where do we hear about them? Tell me where we hear about those Israelites returning from Assyria or being profitable in Assyria. There's two really important books, guys. Jonah. Where did Jonah go?
Nineveh.
To Nineveh. Right? And he was an Israelite that went to Nineveh after the Assyrian capture. And then, remember Tobit? Tobit was all about those guys, and there's a couple of other apocryphal sources about the Assyrians. Why didn't the apocryphal works make it in? Well, they make it into our Bibles because of cost, but why didn't they make it into the Jewish text? Well, one of the reasons is because they're about those dastardly Israelites. I'm surprised Jonah made it.
That's part of the politically correct.
Yeah, you got to be politically correct in here, right? Remember, we said that their main choice was whether they had been written in Greek or not, whether they thought they originated in Greek. But we found out that many of them had not originated in Greek, they originated in Hebrew. So there's some other prejudice going on there, right? And it's kind of obvious, the prejudice that are moving around. In any case, he transports into exile, guys, me in Magal. And they translated this pass, but a Magal is a circular path. A Magal. Now, this doesn't sound very happy to us, right? Let me give you the whole thing here. It says, it guides, transports me in exile in pass, in the Magal, a circular track of tezdek, the right. Literally, righteousness is a pretty good translation. The moral or natural correct right. For his is added because of his appellation. His name is heed, mahan, is heed, to heed his name. But to go in a circular path doesn't seem very positive to us, right? Because this is the culture. We got to understand this. Do you remember in the culture of the Hebrews, what is freedom considered?
Wide open spaces.
But still the spaces are constrained or bounded. Yeah, beautiful. Remember, in all the things we've written about, their idea of being free is where they recognize that you're bounded, that there's no way that you could have absolute freedom. Do you notice English is the exact opposite of that? Our idea of freedom is what? We're standing out in Wyoming and you can't see, you can only see the horizon, right? To us, that's freedom. But what do we not recognize?
The boundaries.
There really are boundaries, right? I mean, if you go far enough, you're going to find a fence.
There's also
Or you're going to run into the ocean or to a river or something, right? Or somebody that's angry at you for walking across their land. So there really are boundaries. See? Isn't this interesting? Because their culture assumes what? Boundaries. And our culture assumes no boundaries. And if you ever wonder why we have moral problems or ethical problems within our culture, now this also causes other moral and ethical problems, but they're a little different. But you notice, to put you in a circular path in an area that is bounded but ginormous, what kind of path do you think this is?
you always return to the same spot.
Well, it's the right kind of path. Now look at our view of the world. What is our view of the world? Yeah, linear. That's what I drew for you, right?
We don't go on a circular path.
Yeah. I drew you a linear thing. In this worldview, if you're doing this, or this, or this, what are you looking for? The boundaries. Right. Where if you're in the circular path, what have you done?
You never hit the boundary.
You've accepted the boundaries and you recognize that they exist and you are treading in the path of righteousness.
Sounds like God's covenant.
Well, we'll see that in a
God's
second.
covenant being the boundaries.
Here's some beautiful stuff in 4. It's not even. The word is to gather. Gam. To gather, key. Causal relations. And here we're starting to get some causal relations. I don't usually give you prepositions, but key is a preposition meaning a causal relation. In other words, gather together, together, caused by yalak. To walk with your hands filled. Okay? So you got to get this. This is pretty complex. I know it says, even though I walk, that's not what it says. It says, gather together, caused by yalak, walking with your hands filled. Who is added? Gay, the gay of Tasmedeth, of shades of death. If you remember we had this talk, I talked about the dead and the shades of death. I talked about the place of the dead, Gehenna, and I talked about the shades of death, in other words, the dead. So this is, okay, got to get this. Together, caused by walking with hands full, not through, just the gorge of the shadows of death, literally the shades, the ghost of the dead. Yar, I will revere. If it's I is added, but it's revere. Revere through fear. In other words, remember we fear God? This is that word, revere. Fear, lo, not spoilage. I will not fear spoilage. Cause a relationship, thou. Now we get an actual pronoun. Thou. What's the thou relating to? God. Thou. Ata. Thou, R is added, amad, along with shabet, your rod, literally your stick. And by the way, figuratively it means clan. Your clan, your stick, your shabet. Why would it be clan? What would a rod have to do with a clan? It's a symbol of the clan, exactly. And your staff, your mish'enah, your support, your mish'enah, your support. They, and here's a pronoun, him, it's a masculine pronoun, him, comfort, it's literally nacham, to sigh in consolation, to console. Okay, so what do we make of this? This is a really interesting and important verse because, you know, I think the translation is way too simple for the complexity of this specific thing, but literally it relates directly back to the other one. So you notice, what is mish'enah? What do you think mish'enah is? Pun. It's a pun. It's a pun relating to the Mishnah. What's the Mishnah? The Mishnah is the Torah, right? It's a pun relating to the Mishnah. So the literal point, remember, the whole thing is it said before that you're going to let me settle. You let me settle and lay down in, you know, the best of the best of the best. And then it says that you cause me to walk in circular paths of righteousness, right? And you make me turn back into the correct path, right? And now it's saying that what is the reason? What is the support? What is all the boundaries? The Mishnah.
God's boundaries.
The support. It tells you two things. It says one is the Mishnah, which is the law, right? And the other one is the clan. Now what's interesting about this is, remember, the Mishnah is the oral Torah. Remember that? So the pun is on the oral Torah. What's the subsumption or assumption here? Well, there's a verbal Torah, but what would you think the other one is? The clan or the Shebet? The stick would be the Torah. So it's really interesting how the author, you know, I think I mentioned this last week, but it really irritates when people say that a pun was not intended. Because if you thought of it and you said it, then that you intended it, right? If you didn't think of it and you said it and you don't take credit for it, you're kind of silly. Because a pun means your brain's thinking pretty well. And in English, puns are a big deal, right? Do you think puns are a big deal in other languages? Yeah, Greek puns are crazy, okay? In Hebrew, puns are obviously an important point, right? It's very euphemistic language. So I think it's interesting here. The point of this whole thing is that this relates back, remember, everything's parallelism, right? We're talking about parallelism. So God makes you turn back and makes you walk in circular paths within the boundaries. In this specific point, it's telling you that those boundaries are formed by the Torah and the Mishnah, by the law specifically, and that the fact that God is with them through what? How is God with them? Through the Torah and the Mishnah. Because God gave them the Torah, right? And God gave them the Mishnah. One is the oral Torah, one is the written Torah. And, you know, the thing is that you can take this in a multi-context, because remember, he was praying for nefesh, right? To protect his nefesh. And there's no relation here to ruach. What is the presumption of the author? What happens when he dies? Yeah, that's it. He's going to Gehenna. Well, if he's that far along, he's going to Gehenna. But in the previous assumption, they were what? Just gone. That's it, right? So he's saying to protect him from the shades of death. In other words, from the fear of death. The fear of death. And what gives him protection from the fear of death? I think this is very prescient.
Life everlasting.
Well, no, not life everlasting. The Torah and the Mishnah. The reason I say this is presumptive is because there's no indication that the author knows anything about eternal life or about, you know, a future of Ruach or anything like that. But there's a presumptive thing here. If the Torah and the Mishnah are going to protect you from the shades of death, what does that mean? It means there's a presumption of something else. See? And the fact that at the end, the word that's used is comfort me, it also means to sigh. Dual use. Because why would he be sighing? Well, because that's all he's is death, right? He's looking death in the face. So I saw it. But also, it means to comfort. So you have a dual use here. You have this euphemistic use where it's comforting. This poetry, we want to look at this poetry as if it's just simple stuff, right? The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. It ain't exactly the way it is, guys. So, it does mean the Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want, but it also means, wow, all this other stuff is in there. It's packed full of this stuff. And you could write this in English, about 100 ways. And they'd all get a similar kind of meaning. You see what I'm saying? But the complexity is just phenomenal. And, it doesn't change our view, does it? It just brings out more and more within the context of this. Because to us, it's just what? A simple poem. We teach our kids it.
And we try to make it at the literal level because we don't see the lower levels.
Well, I think we're afraid of lower levels. We expurgate stuff all out of our stuff because we're afraid people aren't ready for it. They're ready for it. There's stuff you can't expurgate. Look at the rest of this. 5. Literally, arach. You set in a row, you put in order shochan, a meal. Literally a meal. A table is a meal in Hebrew.
7-course meal.
Payam, in the face. In the presence, neged, in front of, it says enemies, but that's not the word, it's tithar. It means those who cramp. The context here is that remember, what did you do at a table? Did you sit at a table? No, you recline at a table. So they're reclining at the table. The point is, what has God done? It's not his enemies. God has given him a place at the table. Because where would you be cramped at a table? If you're at the servant's table, what do you have to do? You have to sit up. Servants and slaves sit up. They sit, like we do. We're servants and slaves. We sit. What do you do when you're a free person? You recline. So therefore, God has made him what?
At ease.
Free. He's made him free. A free person. So instead of being cramped at the table's set before him, and he gets to do what? Recline at the table instead of being cramped. So I got a problem with them translating this of my enemies. It literally means that God has made the writer free. You anoint, and this is really neat, you dashen, literally to be fat. You fat my head. And it's not just head, it's the verb. Shake the head. Remember the shake the head verb? The shake the head verb? Literally, you make me the leader because of the fat that they put over my head. With oil, literally with sheman, with olive oil. And it's really funny because we take it out of context. My cup, a container, overflows. Well, it overflows, literally the word is rava, which means to slake my thirst. But the connotation is, what is the container overflowing with? Oil. Yes. What does this euphemistically mean? What would it mean that your container of oil is overflowing?
Bountiful.
That it's bountiful because you're the leader, you're the king. This could be taken as a coronation psalm because of the context here. But there's even more because, putting fat on your head with oil relates directly to what culture? They probably didn't teach you this in grade school, but they should have. What culture puts fat on their head?
Well, if it's fat, it's not vegetable oil, which would be olive oil.
It talks about olive oil, but it talks about fat on your head. The Egyptians had put...
Sacrifice also.
No, the Egyptians did this. The Egyptians put a cone, they were cone heads. They put a cone of fat on their head. And the cone of fat would melt over time, and it would be full of fragrances, and the cone of fat would basically flow over their faces. And so they thought it made them cool. Try it at your home, okay? But I don't advise you. I'm not sure why they thought this was good, but it would do grease down your head.
Keeps the bugs away.
It may have kept the bugs away. Final verse. Ka, ach, a participle of acclamation. Surely, tov, good, and shashed, the kindness of God. Remember, there's no love in the Old Testament. will follow, radaf, will run after with hostile intent. In other words, the good will run after me with hostile intent, capture me. All the whole, literally the kol, the days of Yom, the period of my life, the time I'm alive, and I will dwell, yeshav, sit down. Remember this word yeshav instead of this word? Yeshav, I will settle in the Beit, a house of Yahweh, forever. The length of, it's not really forever, it's orach, the length of time, for the length of my life, literally. So I'll talk about the indicators. We'll complete with the indicators next week, and we'll also look at the 51st to the 55th Psalms, 151st to the 155th, the ones that aren't included, and we'll do a conclusion. So thanks for your attention. Father God, we thank you for this day and for your word. We pray you look after us this week. In your name we pray. Amen.
There are invitations for everybody on the table. You guys would